Hi, everyone. Welcome to Reimagining America Part 2. Why all the protests? Having the talk about race and racism. My name is Renee Edwards, and I am the Program Director for Fairfax County Public Library. Please allow me to introduce our series creator and facilitator, Dr. Mark Hopson. Dr. Hopson is the Director of African and African American Studies and Associate Professor of Communication at George Mason University. He is co-editor of the forthcoming book, Reimagining Black Masculinities, Critical Essays on Race, Gender, and Public Space. Welcome and thank you, Dr. Hopson.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, all. Thank you to Renee Edwards. Thank you to Jessica Hudson and Fairfax County Public Library. Thank you for your support and your action at this crucial time. And thank you to all our viewers and listeners for tuning in today. And a special thanks to Dr. Gina Castle, Assistant Professor of Communication at St. John's University and author of the book Talking Black and White, an Intercultural Exploration of 21st Century Racism, Prejudice, and Perception. Reimagining America, Discussions on Race, Justice, and Social Protest is our attempt to understand and learn from where we are now. Our time will be structured in 3 parts. I'll begin with a few words regarding our theme. Next, you'll hear from Dr. Castle. And finally, together, Dr. Castle and I will respond to a few questions from the audience. So, let's get to it. Part 2 seeks to examine the question, why all the protests? We'll sum it up like this: to challenge a pervasive anti-Black sentiment, to put forth what Black Lives Matter would call a demand that working for a world where Black lives are no longer systemically targeted for demise, to remind us that oppression is never static, it's always dynamic, and protests include voices of the unheard. Now, on Monday, we mentioned perceptions of anti-Black sentiment that included the disrespectful, irresponsible, and predictable violence toward people of color and Black people specifically. These protests call attention to that anti-Black sentiment. Next, social movements don't normally foreground any one leader, but Black Lives Matter certainly has contributed to leadership for a broader vision. Black Lives Matter is not meant to claim that other lives don't matter, yet it is a reality that needs to be addressed when considering the alarming rate of police-related violence toward Black life. Black Lives Matter is a declaration, it is a reminder, and a rhetorical practice of calling this value into existence. Also, remember, oppression doesn't find a home with any one individual or group. It will continue to come for you at some point. This is why these protests and demonstrations have included people from all backgrounds. The multiplicity is what continues to energize this movement. Last, Martin Luther King Jr. once said that riots are the language of the unheard. I agree. However, language is important here, so I won't refer to current events as riots. In most case scenarios, what we're seeing is the constitutional right to gather and to protest. Now, protests contribute to the talk about racism. Protests are based on a basic communication model, including the sender, the receiver, and ongoing noise. And that noise may be physical and psychological. And last, protests push us to consider perceptions of self and other. In other words, protests are another step toward the talk about race and racism. Although extreme, let's not forget the more quiet attempts have been ignored. So now people are sending messages the best way they can. Will the intended audience receive the message? If not, it might be because of the noise. Again, noise is psychological and it is physical. Noise includes perceptions of the unfamiliar and things we don't understand, including what we don't understand about other people. So let's look at perception. Perceptions include 3 steps: to select, organize, and interpret. So if I were to ask, what do you see here? Some of you would say, I see a woman. Others might say, I see a young woman. Still others may say, I see an older or more mature woman. Whatever you see is based on your familiarity with the image and what you select, organize, and interpret as a worldview. Undoubtedly, those of us familiar with this image know what to look for right away. Others who may not be familiar will have a harder time distinguishing between the 2 faces. I think what's most important about this particular image is that it shows us how sometimes it takes other people to show us what we don't see on our own. And also, it challenges us to rethink what we consider old. I mean, think about it. When you were just a child, didn't you consider the age you are now to be old? Now, if I ask you, you'd probably say, no, it's still pretty young. I think about the social construction of age in terms of perception. It's all about where you are in your journey. Now, do you feel old? That's a rhetorical question. All right. In terms of how perceptions influence our worldviews, let's look at it this way. I'm going to put forth a couple statements, a couple questions for you as homework. You can either answer in the chat or we can address some of these responses later on. But when you think about perception as selection, organization, and interpretation, how do you respond to these 3 questions? The first question, Colin Kaepernick took a knee during the national anthem. Was this an expression of disrespect or freedom of speech? The second question regarding perception is this: why is it easier to see oppression of the past as opposed to the present? And then last, what are challenges to having the talk about racism? So as we think about the talk as dialogue or communication model, including what we understand or what we seek to understand about race and racism, there are a few key terms we should consider. Many of these terms are mistakenly used interchangeably and erroneously. So as an educator, I think it's important that we begin with a starting point for how to have the discussion. Some of the more common terms you will hear include the word prejudice. Prejudice is a personal opinion and bias for or against individuals and groups. Key term there is personal and opinion. Prejudice is a personal opinion and bias for or against individuals and groups. Because it's personal, it may or may not impact other people. Now, discrimination includes actions based on personal opinions and bias for or against individuals and groups. Now, actions might impede upon the progress of other people. So, for example, if we're sitting in a classroom and I say to you, everyone wearing a black sweater must sit in the front. That is an action based on my personal opinion or preference for black sweaters. You may not feel any way about it unless you're told to sit in the back. If that action impedes upon your progress, it becomes an example of discrimination based on one's personal opinion, based on prejudice or bias for or against individuals and groups. Again, the difference between those two words include personal opinion and actions. Now, racism is an interesting term. This includes the structural, systemic, and societal implementation of prejudice and discrimination for or against individuals and groups. Racism picks up on and extends prejudice and discrimination by creating a system based on prejudice and discrimination. Whereas prejudice is personal, racism is systemic. It doesn't require one person to be present in order for racism to operate. Because it's structural, systemic, and societal, it operates regardless. So if we look at the ways in which racism has worked in America, it might include segregation. Segregation included personal opinions, but segregation was also based in actions that worked against individuals and groups. That segregation was founded within a system, a structure, a society based in racism. Last but not least, privilege. Privilege is unearned advantage based on social identity. Social identity might include race, gender, class, sexual identity, ability, information, etc. The thing about privilege is that it's sometimes unnoticed by those of us who hold it because we take it for granted. We assume it is normal. So again, as we look at these four terms, remember, they don't all mean the same thing. They're different words with different definitions for different reasons. And our talk should acknowledge that. Now that we've covered perceptions, I'd like to look at some perceptions of history. And in some ways, I want to respond to an email I received recently regarding how to begin to teach from a more honest and authentic place. And so I challenge the educator to think about perceptions in history, right? So oftentimes we're taught that American history includes slavery and slaves were seen as someone less than human. We don't oftentimes spend time on the fact that African civilizations date back to the origins of human existence. We don't spend time on the fact that within East Africa and North Africa, there were early practices of art, science, law, and other forms of social life. Also, we use the word slave so much that we don't think about it as enslaved Africans. So we have to think about the way in which we frame the lessons we want to teach. Did you know that some of the oldest skeletons in the world were found in East Africa? In fact, Lucy in Ethiopia is said to be over 3 million years old. That is worthy of mentioning. That is a worthwhile accomplishment. That is something that a lot of students need to know. So we reframe and we reconceptualize how we teach history. Now, in terms of American slavery and prosperity, we should also think about teaching our students that slavery brought great wealth to Britain and its colonies through cotton and tobacco crops. It literally made Great Britain one of the most wealthy places in the world, right? And even within the United States, the history of America includes companies that are around today with ties to the slave trade. In fact, in 2002, a well-known insurance company acknowledged policies that ensured enslaved Africans in the 1850s. There are benefits to being tied to that particular trade that we are just now beginning to understand. Also, in 1808, surely Congress passed a law against importing enslaved people. Yet smuggling occurred, and Southern plantations, including those in Virginia, increased their dependency on enslaved labor. Now, how does history matter today? In terms of perceptions of incarceration, in 2018, Black Americans represented 33% of the sentenced prison population, nearly triple their 12% share of the US adult population. So in this case, the minority became the majority when it came to incarceration. Whereas white Americans accounted for 30% of prisoners and about half of their 63% share of the adult population. Additionally, Hispanics accounted for 23% of inmates compared to 16% of their adult population. So there are reasons why within the Black experience, we question law enforcement, incarceration, and things of that nature. Now, in terms of perceptions of police violence, these perceptions differ even among the ranks. In 2017, 67% of police officers described highly publicized deaths of Blacks as isolated incidents, while 31% described them as signs of a broader problem. Conversely, Black officers were almost twice as likely as white officers to say that deaths of Blacks are signs of a broader problem and not isolated incidents. So we understand that history impacts today. And we must consider the ways that people are marginalized structurally by racial, ethnic, and cultural identities. And we must understand that the history of America is connected to racism. So it behooves us to understand how that system works. Keep in mind that beyond perceptions of incarceration and police violence, we must mention housing and health and education and other aspects of daily life. Disproportionately, Black and Hispanic populations are often existing side by side with much wealthier populations composed of large white or Asian communities. In fact, in Fairfax, there are studies which examine the differences in life expectancy across racial, ethnic, and cultural populations. And some of this information is striking. So what does one do with all this information? How do we interpret this information? How do we use it to make a difference? I did not invent racism, so I do not have an easy answer for you. But I draw from the work of other scholars who examine what's considered to be anti-racist dialogue. And some of this work informs some of the most popular literature out there today, including Robin DiAngelo's work on white fragility. So if someone were to ask, how can I work against that system? Because again, a system works without individuals and groups being around, which means that it needs to be interrupted. It needs to be obstructed. How can I work against racism? Well, from an interpersonal perspective, you can use communication. And that begins with self-reflection. Employ self-reflection. Begin to consider the ways in which prejudice, discrimination, racism, and privilege may work within your lived experience or around you. Begin to think about the ways in which you engage life and how those terms may or may not matter in that experience. Number two, begin to re-envision the surrounding world from other perspectives and recognize other cultures as lending to the world. Re-envision means to reimagine. It means to adjust your perception of the ways in which other cultures, other races, other groups contribute to the world around us. Indeed, if African civilizations contributed things like art and science, medicine, etc., those things should be recognized and applauded. Why not start with Juneteenth? Third step, be willing to contribute to intercultural and interracial interactions. We engaged that point today. To what degree are you willing to engage intercultural and interracial interactions? 4, care about those relationships. Care about intercultural and interracial relationships. Give a darn, make an effort, contribute to disrupting what might be seen as oppressive or marginalized experiences. In this way, you become an ally using your standpoint and whatever privileges come with your particular position to support other individuals and groups. Now, 5 is interesting. Reject racial privilege. If we go back to those definitions and we begin to understand that racism is systemic, structural, and societal, that means that it's going to work whether or not one asks or not. Whether or not one is seeking that privilege, it is going to work anyway. I'm not here to tell you how to reject that privilege, but I'm suggesting to you that if you are benefiting from it, you are condoning it. If you do not condemn it, you condone it. And last but not least, the purpose of this series is for us to move from being empathetic to being more action-oriented. So move from admission of power and privilege to taking action. On Monday, we call this the work of the constructive margin. This speaks to the idea of cultural sensitivity. It's all right to be sensitive. It's great to be knowledgeable. It is great to be aware. But the work doesn't stop there. What do you do once you have the knowledge, once you have the information? How do you use it to make the world a better place? That's the question. So let us move from being sensitive to being responsible. And responsibility includes action. For example, we think about diversity efforts. Diversity is about more than bringing different people into a place. It's about taking responsibility for how that difference matters. So now, we've started somewhat of a conversation about the talk. We're going to move into more discussion about current events. And I'm proud to bring on my good colleague and friend, Dr. Gina Castle. I'm going to ask Dr. Castle to consider the questions we have here on the slide. We'll start at the top, we'll work our way down, and if things move in one or another direction, we'll go there and see if we can't make our way back. Greetings, Dr. Castle.
Hello, Dr. Hopson, how are you?
I'm very well. I am going to minimize this if you don't mind and bring us on.
All right, great.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing. And
well, while you're doing that, I'll just say thank you very much to Fairfax County Public Library and Renee Edwards, the program director, for having me here for this important conversation. And I'm grateful to Dr. Hopson for asking me to, be here to talk about how, the talk matters today. So.
All right, so let me ask this. Is the PowerPoint gone for everyone? Are we good to go?
PowerPoint's gone. Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's do it.
Do you mind?
Oh, please.
Do you mind if before we start, I just acknowledge some, I'm sitting up here as a expert, but I just want to share about ways that I still fail and how I'm still learning about interracial communication.
Please.
I just think it's a really important place to start because it's easy for me to sit up here and to let you assume that I have figured all of this out and that I don't make mistakes. And so I just wanted to share how I fail because in being an ally, I will fail again as much as I try not to. You will fail as you try because we're imperfect humans. Yet this is not an excuse, right? We have to do better and we have to learn to identify where we fail in a specific moment and then address it. And so really it's more about how we respond to failing that actually really matters. So I just want to share a few areas where I put my foot in my mouth, where I said something prejudiced, where where my language contributed to discrimination and even a racist mindset. And I'm gonna share 3 of them that are intentional with you, because they relate to other areas of conversation that I think we might touch on today. And I want you to be able to put yourself in my shoes, and so you understand that I'm having this conversation, with you as a white woman and other white people in the audience. I don't want you to feel intimidated. I just want to share so that we can create a space where learning can actually occur, because I think that's important. So one of the first incident I want to share happened at my doctoral granting institution, and I was speaking with a professor of mine who introduced me to one of the deans on campus. And I'm going to say he was the dean of psychology. However, I didn't know that at the time. He is a Black male, the dean that I was introduced to. And I proceeded to say, oh, it's so nice to meet you. Are you the dean and the director of African American Studies?
I get that.
Right, and I saw his face when I said it. He kind of, his nonverbals were clear. It was kind of like, oh my gosh, again, like I'm Black, so I must be the dean in this area. Like I don't do anything else. And I wasn't very good at this point of taking my foot out of my mouth, but this is one of the ways I've tried to do better. When I thought about that event all day, and I couldn't in the moment figure out how to fix the offense, but I knew I had committed an offense. So later that night, I sent him an email and I just said, hey, I'm so sorry. When I asked you this, I realized that it probably implied that being a dean in African American Studies was all that you were capable of doing, and I just sincerely apologize. That was an honest mistake, but it highlights the idea of the fact that like we need to be more mindful. I need to be more mindful of what I say and how I say it and when I say it, so that not because it's politically correct, but because the people that I'm talking to or people we're around are human beings and they have thoughts and emotions and feelings. And those are the things that, matter. I'm going to tell you maybe one more about Baltimore.
So let me jump in on that.
Okay.
We'll come back to the questions momentarily, but you just said something very important, Dr. Castle. What you've done is kind of walk us through that model we looked at on the last slide. Mm-hmm. You called it an offense or a mistake. On Monday, I called it a misstep in terms of the dance within intercultural communication experiences, right? We stepped on a foot or something along those lines that was very discomforting. You took the first step in terms of self-reflection. Mm-hmm. Thought about it, you gave it some attention, you gave it some time, and then you made the effort to contribute to that relationship. So you went back and you said what needed to be said, and I think in some ways what you did was you rejected the privilege that you could have borrowed or you could have stood on in saying, I won't deal with it. What's done is done. So you use those steps in a few different ways, and I'm sure some of the viewers are probably making connections as well as they chat. Right. But I wanted to just make that point because you're actually helping us to process this particular communication theory called anti-racist dialogue. Now, you were going to give us a second example.
So on this example, I got a little bit better. The first example, I mean, it's better if when you insert foot in mouth or when you misstep in the dance or what could be called as just a microaggression, you're using everyday language and actually for someone else that's offensive, whether you intended it to be that way or not. So for this one, this just happened with a friend of mine on the phone 2 weeks ago, which is, embarrassing for me, but I share it for you on purpose that one of my good friends who was actually a former student of mine at UCF when I was getting my master's, he's a Black male, got his, he has his MD, and he is going on to be a resident at Michigan State, go Sparty, and he's going to be driving there from Orlando all the way to Grand Rapids. And my head just starts turning. Oh my goodness, because I know some people who are from the Grand Rapids area, and I have heard stories about driving while Black through Southern Indiana. And so I say to him, hey, just be careful, when you're driving, because just like, it's just a really, really bad time right now. And he said to me, Gina, are you telling me as a Black man how to be careful while I'm driving?
Wow.
And I said, no. I said, that's not what I meant. Let me rewind. If you'll allow me to rewind, what I actually meant was, I realize you're going to be driving through this area. I care about you, and I know that it's probably going to be difficult. I am not trying to tell you as a Black man how to be worried about driving through a particular area. So what I like about that one is it happened in that moment, and then I rewound, and I was able to express it actually in that moment so that it didn't continue onward. So
interesting. Just to make a connection, what you're doing now in many ways is referring to this idea of perceptions of incarceration, perceptions of interactions with law enforcement. You mentioned DWB. I'm not sure if our viewers know what DWB means, but it's simply a way of saying driving while Black. Mm-hmm. Driving while Black. Many of us growing up in the Michigan area and other areas understand that driving while Black came with risks. Still continues to come with risks, because you might be stereotyped, you might be pulled over, and there's no telling where that interaction will go from there. Right. Now, this is a theoretical perspective or a perception based on the Black experience. Not every Black person has dealt with this. I'm not trying to essentialize, but we will generalize. Driving while Black is as real as what else has been called the school to prison pipeline. Give us understand that even in terms of incarceration, the chances of interacting with law enforcement and coming out on the short end are high.
Right.
So there is a strategy for how to get back and forth. And I think I may have mentioned in the past, at least to a recent group, that for me as a young man in driving while Black, I would sometimes attempt to deconstruct my Black identity. And so I might remove my cap if I was wearing one, or I might turn down the music if I thought it was enough, if it was loud enough to cause attention. Or I might try to, if I had the opportunity, drive a car that had a little bit more of, that included a better perception, a newer car, I should say. So as a young man, I might ask one of my parents if I could borrow their car instead of using mine. And I knew in certain areas of town, driving while Black was a risk. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad that you bring that up. And I'm believing that your friend is probably, or was probably very much in tune with that strategy.
Yep. Didn't even drive through Southern Indiana. Proceeded to tell me how he had looked up 4 routes and was instead going up, around, around.
Exactly.
So.
Exactly. Wow. All right. You had one more?
The other one was right after Freddie Gray was murdered in Baltimore. And this is for me, this one, I share this with my students, but it still gives me pause in the way that I responded. So I'm driving into Baltimore, and it's getting dark, and the place we're staying, I know something about the location where we're staying. It's in an Airbnb. It's near Johns Hopkins University. I'm thinking about the area. I'm thinking about the protests. And I find myself starting to think about the area as scary, and that maybe it wouldn't be safe. And this is this is in 2011. This is embarrassing to me, saying it now, but I say that because I had this epiphany. So the person I was with was like, hey, Gina, you're being racist right now. And I thought, That's probably true. Like, I am generalizing about an entire area based on what I'm watching happening on the news. And I think that's something that is very relevant to what's happening today. It's easy to watch something on the news and instead of question what we're seeing, take it all in as this is exactly what's happening. But another thing some of my work has to do with perception and how police officers' perceptions of the areas that they go into might impact how they communicate with the people there. And so I'm talking about heavily Black and brown areas, and that their idea of, because just like me, idea of their prior knowledge of, I got this call, I'm going to this area, it's predominantly Black or African American, it's predominantly Latino, it's predominantly whatever it is, that impacts your demeanor when you go into that area. And so that was the reason why I started looking at how perception impacts how we talk with people who are different from us, and the need to be like critically conscious of that.
One of our viewers actually chatted on the importance of implicit bias training.
Yes.
To the ways we perceive the world around us. Again, I can't emphasize that enough. If you think about the way in which you create a worldview, it's all through perception, right? You pay attention to certain things, you organize those things into a narrative that you can understand, and that narrative becomes the way in which you interpret the phenomena or the way in which you see the world around you.
Mm-hmm.
Impacted by everything we know and don't know. And too often what we don't know, we fill in the blanks with misinformation.
Right. Yeah, because we're used to certain scripts. Like, we're used to following a script. We're used to following a pattern. Like, I'm going to do this and then this is going to happen. And that implicit bias creates the racial atmosphere wherein Dylan Roof walks out of the church in Charleston where he committed a mass murder, and he walks out alive, yet Philandro Castile is killed at a traffic stop in the car with his girlfriend and 4-year-old child in the backseat. And so the bias of this person in this particular area, and then another person in a different area, your location matters. And I think that some of the reasons why we're seeing, I don't want to say just seeing, because police bias, there's a culture of acceptance that's been sustained within like the way that we police, even going back to like plantation slavery. But I think that this is one of the reasons why we're seeing and now talking about police bias, and that it needs to play a huge role in their training. So that we need to respond, not react. So we need to like catch ourselves in the moment. And I talk about this in my book, like when I notice myself doing something, or for these police officers, they're being called to a certain location, then they need to just pause. Like, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? Why are you doing, like, why are you feeling that? Why are you thinking that? What are you projecting onto the location you're about to be in and the people there? How is that going to influence how you respond? So just taking that moment to pause and respond instead of react would probably save people's lives, Black people's lives, Pause and call for backup if you're so terrified, for example,
Yes. There are different perceptions and different perspectives going on at all levels of government, city, state, and federal. And I think one of the commonalities would be this idea of training and education. But training and education needs to include a focus on that anti-Black sentiment we discussed earlier, and understanding how bias plays a role in the way in which different populations are perceived. Because believe it or not, race is socially constructed. It's an assumption that people are different, but in fact, in many ways, we're very similar biologically. It is an assumption of biology, but as real or even more so is racism. And
Right.
Racism impacts people at different levels in ways that are sometimes even deadly, sometimes even fatal. So let me go back to your comment about Freddie Gray.
Mm.
As we look at current events and we look at the demonstrations and the protests coming out of George Floyd's death, what were your personal feelings, your personal thoughts? I know you're an educator. I mean, what does that do to you when you are going throughout your day to day?
Well, I guess it's on two parts. There's that educator standpoint and the part of me who wants to be a critically conscious, supportive ally. And then it's personal too. So I have a 4-year-old son. He's Black. His dad was Black. He presents as Black. And so when I look at what happened to Freddie Gray, and I would just encourage you, watch the whole video.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if you're in the audience and you're also white. I think it's important to, like with Emmett Till, his mother made sure that casket was open so that
Mm-hmm.
people could see the result of, prejudice and discrimination put into action. And so with Freddie Gray or with George Floyd, watch the whole video. Watch the video that Benjamin Crump, the attorney for the family, just put up because it's horrific and worse than the first one. I think it's important to do that. So on a personal level, I think, oh my gosh, when is this going to stop? Again, like we are doing this again. And it just kind of feels like, why aren't we creating policies that will stop this, that will stop like the senseless murder? Why aren't we creating policies that help people pause and respond instead of react? Like, why aren't we holding people accountable? As an educator, I'm in New York City, and at St. John's University, there are lots of students of color in my class, lots of Black students in my class. So you can't just walk into class after something happens and not talk about current events. So you have to give people space to process, because the unfortunate thing is, when someone in your family dies, you take a mental health day. Maybe you take a mental health week. But the students don't get that opportunity. And quite frankly, like Black and brown people who are going to work don't get that opportunity either. Like, you just have to keep going on with what you're going on with while you deal with the emotional trauma from watching another person who looks like you be murdered for, in this case, he was just laying there, and nobody was doing anything about it, even though the bystanders were, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? So from an educating perspective, it's important to give the students time to pause. And as an ally, you can't be an ally for everyone. Everyone doesn't want you to be an ally. That's okay. I've learned that the hard way. But like in your relationships with people, like in your interracial relationships, like for me, I have several very, very good friends that I've had for between 17 and, just a few years, who are all Black. And so for me, my responsibility during that time is to just reach out and say, hey, how are you doing? I think I said terrible week that we're having right here. Not just terrible week, terrible, a terrible replaying of history in the present that we're having here. And just wanted to reach out and check in. But it's important that we don't just ask every Black person we know that, right? Because if you've lost a parent or you've been through something traumatic and someone who you're not very close to walks up to you and just asks you about it, it's triggering, it's traumatizing, because it takes away that person's agency to decide if they want to share that information, with whom, when, and it takes away their ability to exit the conversation. So we have to make sure that they have agency when they do it. But if it was personal, because it could have been my son or any one of my friends, as an educator, we have to pause. And as an ally, not only do we need to check in with our very close friends, but then we need to figure out ways where we can contribute to the conversation, because I'm tired of hearing, if he didn't run, he'd still be alive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and if you weren't wearing a hoodie, you'd still be alive. Trevor Noah said this on the Daily Show the other day. If you weren't sleeping in your bed, you'd still be alive. But really, perhaps what it actually is maybe if you weren't Black, you would still be alive, is what he said. And so we have to reflect on how skin color matters.
Mm-hmm. Hey, so what I'm going to do is take a bit of a different turn here, and I'm going to keep us on point. But what I'm going to do is ask if Renee will draw from some of the questions that have been coming through on the chat. I'm seeing some really good stuff come up, and of course I can't get to it all. But Renee, if you see one or two, we can pause, because what I'm going to do is ask Gina shortly to give us more examples or more discussion on what it means to be an ally. In other words, what do you mean when you use that term? And then how is it done? Are there strategies for how to be an ally? So I'm coming back to that. But I'm hearing questions and hearing comments, for example. Two comments spoke to the idea of time to process in the work. I hear you. So there's a third one. Time to process is important, certainly. And, when we talk about mental, emotional, or psychological health, consider this. Issues of race and racism are examples of violence. Those types of violence impact us emotionally, psychologically, and mentally.
Mm-hmm.
You think about it, even relationship abuse qualifies the emotional, the verbal, the psychological aspect of that as being a way of abusing.
Mm-hmm.
You hear, what you think, how you feel about yourself, how you feel about others, the value that you assume people have or not for you. So there is a lot going on in terms of how we process what we've been seeing recently. I used this phrase earlier this week, and I'm going to use it again. We have been going through a pandemic, but lately, in terms of the Black body and police violence, it's been an epidemic within that pandemic. And so again, it's all based in this idea of overcoming this societal illness. I am going to pause. I'm going to ask Renee if you chose a question.
Yeah, Angela had a comment to the first example that you gave, Dr. Castle, about apologizing to the Dean of Psychology. And she said that you can apologize, but sometimes it may not be accepted, and that's okay. And that was really profound to me. Can you talk about that? If a white person apologizes and it's not received, what should the response be?
This is such a great question. Here's the deal. It's not going to be received a lot because you're the 100th person who's done that probably. And so that is just something that comes with being an ally, to be honest with you, or like being critically aware of what's happening in the moment. Your apology is not always going to be received. It's because it's just another time that it's happened. It's another time that you infringed upon someone's agency, another time that you undervalued their position and their intellect. And here, as a white person, your job isn't to be like, oh my gosh, they didn't take my apology. I apologized to someone 2 weeks ago, a colleague who was not thrilled with me for, I triggered her by asking her like, hey, how are you doing? She's like, we don't talk enough for you to ask me how you're doing. Like, I don't want to explain this. I don't want to talk about this right now. I apologize. Guess what? She did not receive it. And you know what? It's not her job to make me feel better about what I just said. It's my job to like receive and listen to what I heard and keep it moving. Like put it in practice, share the experience, and then keep it moving so that, I don't do the same thing again. But absolutely, you're not going to not apologize because it might not be received either, right? So in the situation with the dean, he was very gracious, but he doesn't have to be gracious just because I apologized. It's not his, it's just just because someone apologizes doesn't mean the hurt goes away. It still inflicted a pain. It still had what you said still mattered. It changed the room. It changed the dynamic. It created an atmosphere, and it's okay. Like, this is where you have to, like, we are just white people. We are not owed. We are not owed by Black people. Like, we are not owed their comfort. They don't need to comfort us after we offend them. Like, we need to like deal with it on our own and deal with it within our circle of like close friends, right? And certainly, yeah, I'll just say that. They don't all, they don't have to accept the apology. I could just go on about that one, so.
Wow. Wow. Renee, do you have another one?
Yeah, we had another question from C. They wanted you to discuss privilege in more detail. I'm struggling with trying to explain it to others. And are there any recommended books to read?
Oh, privilege. Go to Peggy McIntosh and look at her work on white privilege. Peggy McIntosh says that white privilege, and Peggy McIntosh identifies as a white European American woman. Peggy McIntosh says that white privilege is like a knapsack of invisible privileges that one can pull from at any given time. And so if we use Peggy McIntosh's work, we could draw from that list. And what we would do is ask ourselves whether or not we can all make the same claim. So Peggy McIntosh would say something along the lines of, I could walk through the mall relatively certain that I won't be followed or suspected of a criminal offense. You know, and some of us would say, well, why would that ever happen? But there are some of us who know that, you know, driving while black can also translate into walking while black, right? It could also mean that when I enter a certain environment, a certain context, I'm going to be suspected of things that others might not be. And so that invisible privilege is a comfort. I'll take it back to this. One of our other chats asked to contextualize racism. So let's make the connection in this way. Racism is a system that includes two types of resources. One would be tangible resources, the other would be intangible resources, right? The tangible resources might be access to things that marginalized groups and individuals and groups don't have access to, be it housing, be it healthcare, be it certain types of employment, etc. Right? Those are things that you can touch and see. The intangible would be things you don't necessarily see, but they still make a great difference in the way in which we live our daily lives. The intangible would be confidence, self-esteem, self-assured, right? Understanding your value in the world. In many ways, Peggy McIntosh highlights the fact that walking through the world in that way is a great privilege. It means that you can take part in conversations at the job and not be accused of being either anti-America or anti-leadership or things that sometimes people of color have to deal with. Assumptions that are made against marginalized individuals and groups. And so some of these privileges find their way into our daily lives in such
Dr. Hopson, you are frozen.
I'll just maybe just step in until he is unfrozen. I love this question, and I've had to, and it's so important.
Am I clear?
Oh, I was just stepping in while you were frozen. I'll just finish what I was gonna say, or do you want to continue? Right.
I think he's frozen again.
Okay. So for me, I saw a great post on Instagram the other day, and it just said, hey, white privilege doesn't mean that you've never suffered. It means on top of all the struggles that we experience as humans, the color of our white skin has not added to the suffering in our life. And I just thought that was a really simple way to think about it. So I think, well, I have my own struggles in life, and because I'm white, I do not also have to be concerned about how people feel about the color of my skin. Like, I do not, as a white person, also have to be concerned how people will perceive me, if they'll find me frightening or intimidating. And so, we have struggles as white people, but they're not related to skin color, and not having to deal with the struggles that come with living life black or brown makes life a little bit easier. It's a privilege that we don't have to think about. So, but I love that definition. Of all the struggles we experience as humans, the color of our skin has nothing to do with it. It's not added to our struggle as a white person.
So I'm just looking for Dr. Hopson's name so I can unmute him.
I'm here, right?
Okay, you're perfect. All right, I have no idea what happened, but I'm glad we resolved
Okay.
it. All right,
I'm
perfect.
sorry. My apology. I'm sure that Dr. Castle responded well, but the idea of privileges, they say it's like a fish being in water. You don't necessarily know you're in it until you don't have it, right? So you move out of your context of comfort, and all of a sudden you realize what you had before is no longer available to you. Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. May I ask another question, or did you have one for us, Renee? Okay. So, Dr. Castle, we're talking about the talk. We're actually practicing the talk as we talk about it, right? We're engaging it. We're drawing from theoretical perspectives. But you've also written a book, and I want to know how much of what you've written in the book are we seeing today? In other words, this idea of talking black and white. How is that going in the world today from what you can see?
That's interesting. I kind of feel like, I mean, I started writing that book a little bit before it was published. And honestly, I look at some of the things that people shared with me. I'm one of the parts of town where I interviewed people was in and around the DC area. And I'm just disturbed by, you know, some of the things that some of my white interviewers, you know, told me that they didn't like about Black people. And so when I look at, for example, racism is disappearing or racism isn't that bad, it just makes me like, sometimes I struggle. I'm like, have we made any progress at all? And then I have to remind myself, like, okay, like we are making some progress. We have to recognize that we've been socialized to see, you know, some people inferior and other people as superior. And that as humans, we are all prejudiced, but because we've gained information, like Robin DiAngelo says, like, hey, we've gained information about society, you know, from the people around me. And this information helps me make sense of, you know, particular groups of people by their cultural framework. And that our prejudices are shared because we swim in the same cultural waters, if you will. And so we project the same cultural images onto particular groups. So one of the things I talked a lot about in there, and it was a chapter on police brutality and how, just simply what I was saying, like perception and bias, like prejudice and bias, our affinity against a particular group of people, you know, how that created the atmosphere where I forget his name. I want to say Chauvin, Officer Chauvin, like puts his knee on George Floyd's neck for almost 9 minutes. It's just, it creates the opportunity for that to happen. And so, so it's hard for me because I have to remind myself we have to keep doing the work. I want to be cynical and say, gosh, like, are we making a difference at all? But I look around what's happening today and think it's really encouraging that there are so many people involved in the conversation and who are trying to get involved in the conversation. So.
All right. Can you describe any specific challenges to the talk about race and racism, either from a personal or a professional experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about this on a personal example just yesterday. My 4-year-old son says, "Mommy, I want to get a Nerf gun." And I thought that's so interesting. For most kids, this is just a water gun, but my kid can never have one. And so, like, there's a challenge, and how do I have a conversation about race with my 4-year-old that while white people could carry this Nerf gun and not be perceived as a threat, that because he is Black, that if he carries this, could be considered a threat, that he needs to be calmer in public so he doesn't draw attention to himself. I also was just different things I've thought about and examples of the talk happening today and challenges. You asked about challenges, right? You said
Yes,
that?
indeed.
Okay. I think listening is the biggest challenge, because for white people, I'm gonna talk about it from a white perspective. I think that we're so concerned about our response to what someone says that we're not actually engaging in active listening, and active listening from the perspective of you're seeking to understand what someone is saying to you and to demonstrate that you've heard what they said, not to wait for someone to take a breath and respond. Like, it's okay just to listen, and like it's not pie, okay? Like, listening to someone's perspective doesn't take away from your own perspective. Now, I've been saying it's not pie for years. Like, if I cut a piece out of pie here to listen to what someone's saying, I'm going to have less for me. That's not the way it is. And now people are using the pie reference. But anyway, like, just because I'm listening to what someone says doesn't mean I can't hold in tension what I think about what's going on and how I'm processing that and what someone else is telling me they're experiencing. So I think there's a real problem with listening. And that's very challenging to the talk, 'cause from an interracial perspective, we are not white people, I feel like, could do a much better job listening first and seeking to understand rather than, denying it. Oh, that wasn't racism, or defending yourself and minimizing the experience that happened. Oh, this is an isolated incident. And so I think that makes it challenging. I think that makes it challenging. Having preconceived ideas about who people are makes it challenging. It's also hard to have the talk because we are not educating in K through 12. Like, the first time I talked about intercultural communication was in college. And as an undergrad, I remember I didn't really get it. I had a professor who taught history of Southern politics. He was excellent, a white British guy, really, really great at giving us images and like making us think. But I didn't really critically understand it until grad school. And that's a problem. So the way that we're educating people in general, it's also challenging because we don't take the time to ask, when you say racism, what do you mean? So that we're not using the same terms. This is the main reason I wrote my book. We listen to people on television, and one person says racism and this is, one person says prejudice is this, but we're not using the same language. And it's pretty hard to have a conversation when you can't agree on what the terms mean. So.
Exactly. You made me think about so much of there. Denise has asked the title of Dr. Castle's book. That title is?
It's called Talking Black and White, an Intercultural I don't even know what the rest of it is.
Exploration.
Right next to me. Interracial. Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna let Dr. out. Here it is. Hold on. Okay, it's called Talking Black and White, and it's an intercultural exploration of 21st century racism, prejudice, and perception. It's funny because when you write these, you end up writing so much from it that I just blanked. But it's cheapest on Amazon.
All right. I'm going to go back. I'm going to ask you for another strategy. You gave us listening as one. That's great. But as I'm thinking about what you told us, I'm keeping in mind too that anytime cultures come together, that is intercultural communication, right? We all carry with us different values, beliefs, practices. And anytime we come together, we bring those cultures together. And the goal is to find a way to communicate, right? To commune between those cultures. Now, if there's anything going on between in terms of noise or disruption, that intercultural communication won't be as effective. There won't be as much listening. There won't be as much meaning included. And so that's one of the reasons why we have such a hard time having this talk. All right, so you mentioned listening. Are there other strategies that you've either employed or even written about in your work where one can help one to overcome racism as an impediment to communication?
Yeah, one of the I think it's important to, number one, listening, but the common theme here is I, as a white person, have to start with myself. And what I mean by that is I have to engage in self-reflection myself, and think about the words that I say and how I say it and who that impacts around me, to think about being, like Robin Dan says, being willing to consider, hey, is it possible that because I'm white, I may see things differently? Like I might look at racial dynamics differently and I may not be aware of some of them. It's like doing that own work and thinking for yourself. And that also involves, doing some research. Like Beverly Tatum wrote a super accessible book a long time ago. I think it might be 2002. It's called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And then it says ... because the white kids are. Her book is awesome. And so that's helpful. And just like doing the research. I also like the White Fragility book. I'm admittedly only halfway through it, but I'm enjoying it so far. Doing the research. Another thing, like it's really hard to understand what's going on because we already talked about the education system doesn't teach us about racism. It teaches us about history by US history or history of Middle Eastern culture, history of Britain. It doesn't actually teach us about African history in the North America, right? We're not even talking about what's happening there. So I think one of the documentaries I really like, which I saw for the first time in grad school, is called Unchained Memories, and it's the history of the slave narratives. I definitely recommend that. You can watch that for free on YouTube, and it just kind of takes you through the narratives from freed slaves who are now citizens, or who are now no longer under slavery, and it works you through like their narratives of what being in slavery was actually like, and it's really powerful. It's hard to understand something if you can't transport yourself back to like step in the shoes of that lived experience. And the last part, besides engaging in self-reflection and doing the research and being willing to correct your behavior and take correction from people, is really just thinking about our family of origin. Like, what messages did we receive from our family of origin about race? And how does that impact how we think about people who are different from us? Like, as a white person, how does it impact how I think about Black people? And thinking about like what sort of messages we were told, because a lot of times, we people say, oh, it's just this generation, but it's not. It's this generation that's passing down messages to the next generation, to the next generation, to the next generation. And we need to ask those questions. And then we need to be willing to step in and stop making excuses for our mimas and papas who are too old, because reality is like nobody is too old to be told, hey, what you just said sounds really offensive, and I know you're a great person and you didn't mean it that way, but you might want to watch that. Like it's our job to interrupt it, especially with other white people when we see it, right? We're not going around telling Black people what to do. As a white person, I am responsible for talking to other people who are white to try to create an atmosphere where we can learn, and not just to sit there and laugh at a joke, to say, that's actually not funny. That would just be so powerful,
Wow. Okay, so 3 things. First is the idea of disruption. That takes us back to disrupting systems,
right?
Disrupting structures, disrupting oppression as it moves, right? So the only way we're going to get rid of the system is by disrupting it,
Right.
by deconstructing it. The one thing we can't do is sit back quietly and hope it goes away.
Right.
And some of our audience members might be familiar with the term hegemony. Hegemony is invisible power. Hegemony means that things operate without an individual making it happen, because it's been going on so long that this is how it is.
Mm-hmm.
So if we are letting certain comments slide or certain actions slide, we're really contributing to those oppressive actions. Our silence contributes to it. That's thing number 1. Thing number 2, you talked a little bit about what it means to go through the process of learning. And I'm once again reminded of the dance metaphor that we used earlier. We have a special guest in the house who enjoys the dance metaphor, which I find to be really, really great. But within that, we have what's called the staircase model.
Oh, yeah.
Familiar with it, Gina, as a communication scholar. But the staircase model simply contains 4 parts. Those 4 parts include unconscious incompetence, and some of us have used this in other organizational structures, but unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, conscious competence, and then last, unconscious competence. So
I actually wrote this down in notes, I thought.
Wow. First step is to be unconscious that you are incompetent at whatever. So it takes somebody to call it to your attention.
Right.
If I am dancing at the wedding reception and I can't dance and I'm just flailing away, I won't know unless you pull me aside and perhaps even show me a video. Mm-hmm. Now, once you show it to me and I realize that I'm not the best dancer, I become conscious about my incompetence, right? So I am now aware of my shortcomings because you called it out. You called it to my attention. That's very important to me. You could have let me flail away, but no, you called it to my attention, and now I'm able to make a change because it is something I'm aware of. So I get the lessons, I do the reading, I do the research. I saw a chat here where someone talked about finding resources, not only for educators, but for your students as well. Going out of your way to find out who's doing what around these issues. Becoming versed in the issues, learning the definitions, learning who's creating dialogue around these definitions, learning who's engaging these topics. All of that makes me conscious and somewhat competent. Mm-hmm. I'm aware, I'm thinking, and I'm searching, actively searching for more information. And what we're hoping for society is that one day we don't have to think about it. Mm-hmm. It's competent because it's part of who we are. It's in our DNA. It's in our societal DNA. It's what we've been taught. Justice is what we've been taught. And so we enact that, we engage it, we practice it, even without thinking about it. Mm-hmm. What I hear you saying is that this is a process. One of our viewers said it's the process of becoming. Thank you, viewer. Yes, indeed. It is a process. It is an ongoing process of becoming better.
Right.
We do better. Right. But it takes work. And the work isn't easy. The work hurts. The work is scary. But it still takes the work. And you know what's most interesting is that in any other issue or any other goals, we're willing to invest the work. The question is, why aren't individuals and organizations willing to invest in this work? So I'm going to pause there because I know I'm taking up time. I'm going to ask you if you have a last comment to make, and then I'm going to ask Renee if there are any questions that we should address.
I just think kind of as final thoughts in terms of what can I do about this right now, just goes back to your own language use and reflecting yourself, this goal of becoming a mindful communicator, meaning that you're aware of what you're saying, why you're saying it, and you're aware of how what you're saying matters to other people around you. And so if that's the first thing you do, if you pause, instead of respond, if you think about what you're saying and how it might make someone else feel. It's not red or blue. It's not about politics. It's about being human beings who have feelings and emotions, who are worthy of respect. And so if we could first just learn to think about what we're saying while we're saying it, I just think it would go such a long way and maybe not creating some of those microaggressions. And that is a very, very small first step.
Excellent, excellent. Renee.
All right, so Dr. Hopson, we have a question for you. Do you think racism fully captures what is happening to Black people in this country, or is the correct term anti-Blackness?
You've heard me use anti-Blackness. There are different definitions and different ways of explaining it. I would suggest to you that what we're experiencing is anti-Blackness under a cloak of white supremacy ideology. In other words, the values and the system reflect whiteness. Part of that means that the Black experience is marginalized and omitted from many of those systems, many of those structures underneath that cloak. So there are different ways of putting it. But I think, in terms of our discussion here today, if we're talking about police violence, I can use the executive order, the recent executive order, as an example. Certainly increasing education and information for officers is a great idea. But if you don't include the idea of the anti-Blackness sentiment, if you don't address that specifically, you are missing the boat. So language matters, and I appreciate the viewer for calling that out. Language matters in much the same way it matters at looking at the oppression of different social identities.
Thank you. We had another question. I found great difficulty on making white people understand how color blindness is problematic and hurtful to people of color. Any advice to how to address this issue?
Therein lies the work. I'm going to pass the microphone to Dr. Castle.
I mean, this one is such a struggle, right? I think it goes back to this idea that nobody wants to be perceived white people don't want to be perceived as racist. So, and this is, I was reading just this part in the Robin DiAngelo's book, like white people don't want to be perceived as racist. So when they decide that they're going to be colorblind, because if they don't know, like if they don't notice there's color, and they don't notice people are treated differently because of color, because color doesn't exist to them, then it frees them up to believe that there is no racism and it's not happening. And I think that's one part of the issue, and why we find that white people hold on to that so much, because I think that they are afraid that if they notice color that it's a problem. And I mean, this is like interesting. I'll just say this, like, even from like a spiritual perspective, like God noticed color. He created people in his image, all different colors. And I try to like use that to point it out, because I feel like we have, like we've gotten away from just being able to like notice and identify what's in front of us, because we think it makes us bad, or, that we're going to be perceived as doing something wrong. And, it's just like, if you notice that someone's wearing a red shirt, or you notice that someone is wearing a tie, or you notice that someone is wearing gym clothes, or you notice that someone is driving a particular car or a particular color, like we are not actually colorblind. It's that we pretend to be. And so I would just start with like, hey, I noticed the shirt you're wearing is purple. Like just starting to like help them point out, hey, like you're doing this because like, why are you asking that? When you say colorblind, what do you mean? Is a really good question. When you say colorblind, what do you mean? And then just pointing out areas in life that you see that you see difference. It doesn't make you wrong to see difference. It's actually better to celebrate difference. So that's still a hard one for me to answer, even, honestly.
And I think to be colorblind is also a rhetorical move to separate one from the responsibility for how difference matters.
Absolutely.
It obscures, makes ambiguous this oppressive power we're talking about.
Right.
You don't have to be responsible in your interpersonal relationships, your organizational relationships, and the ways in which society impacts individuals and groups if you can claim to be colorblind. It reminds me of the metaphor, what was it? What was the world the country at one point? Was it a salad bowl or melting pot?
Yeah, melting
pot. But if the dominant values obscure everything else, that is the ideology to which I'm referring, that white supremacy ideology, because it removes and masks everything else. So it behooves me for you to notice my color and also notice the ways in which your actions influence my life on a personal, organizational, and systemic level.
It's also hard to say that we don't notice it, right? Because if you just look at the different protest demonstrations that have happened, I'm deeply troubled by the difference in police treatment that happened in Michigan at the Capitol building, where white men are literally strapped down with semi-automatic rifles and other very and other various weapons, where they're shouting in police officers' faces, but yet like they're treated differently than the protesters that we're seeing every day on the news. They're being treated differently, and so it's hard to say that you don't notice color, right? Because an officer noticing color, like they obviously felt less intimidated by those people yelling in their face and being there with guns than they would have. Like if that had been a group of Black people with semi-automatic weapons, we'd have another massacre. Like, so I think it's important to notice how it matters, and not like use the, not contribute to oppression by pretending it doesn't exist.
Other questions?
We had another question. Can you talk a little bit more on discrimination versus racism? Is discrimination reactive, whereas racism is proactive?
Interesting question. Oh, Gina, I'm sorry.
Can I give this is like something super silly, is that okay? An answer to that? I heard somebody describe it in a way that I found very beneficial. It's from discrimination is the action that you take. So prejudice might say, hey, I don't like Black people and I don't want them to move into my neighborhood. And discrimination might be like, I'm the director of the HOA and I'm not going to approve any Black applications. I'm going to take this action based on my preference for white people, and I'm not going to allow any Black people to be approved to move in this neighborhood. And then racism is like, I'm going to take it another level. Not only am I the HOA director for this neighborhood, I am going to take this policy to the county, and I'm going to make sure that we create policies that keep Black people out on a policy level. So it takes it up to the systemic level. But I just think that's a really that's just one of the examples I use with students when I'm breaking it down in language they, to make it identifiable. So I don't know what else you were going to add to it, Dr. Hopson.
I think that's a great example. I would also include that I don't think discrimination and racism are separate entities. I think they are inherent to one another, right? It is the power behind that action. It is the power behind that prejudice that brings it to life. Mm-hmm. Also noticing that other chats are saying things, or at least mentioning how difficult it is to educate individuals and groups who might not want to receive the information. And I would just say that, there has been a long history of educators, both within the classroom and outside, who have tried to inform and bring to life these issues and ideas. And it takes a lot of energy and it takes a lot of time. And so what you have to decide is where you want to spend your energy and where you want to spend your time. Not everyone is going to accept your truth. Not everyone is going to accept your reality. But sometimes when I engage individuals who might want to express their opinions, I'll give them a few minutes. But generally, if we're going to have an engaged discussion regarding these issues, I also want to hear where the individual is finding their information, right? Where are you getting this information? Offer a source, offer a resource. Give me something that I can read so that I can evaluate for myself what you have described to me as truth. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it's just a matter of opinion. And we can go all day back and forth about our opinions. Mm-hmm. But if you want to understand Dr. Castle's example about the HOA, then you need to do some research on redlining. You need to do some research on the ways in which housing has been used against Black and brown populations. So it becomes real. Discrimination is very much a real experience. And I asked the question earlier in our time, why is it easier to talk about oppression of the past as opposed to the present? I think a simple answer is that we find it hard to see the forest for the trees. Hindsight is 20/20, but not everyone is visionary enough or able to reimagine what the world could look like. We go through these steps, we go through this material, and it sounds easy peasy. It sounds like, oh, this is stuff I could have come up with myself. And that's probably true. But I dare you to engage it. I dare you to practice it. I dare you to enact it in your daily lives. That is where the real work comes in.
I love Andrew Cuomo, who is my governor, said the other day, talking about this, hey, everyone's entitled to their opinions, but they're not entitled to their own facts. And that's what I was thinking when you were saying that. We're just not entitled to our own facts.
Wow, wow.
Thank you, Dr. Hopson. Thank you, Dr. Castle. This was a wonderful, enlightening discussion. I really hope our participants benefited. The comments were flying in our chat. I will be sharing this chat along with a video on our library website. We have tons of wonderful books available through Fairfax County Public Library. I will also make sure to provide that link to people who registered. Thank you so much. Yes, Dr. Hopson.
One comment, you mentioned resources. So the PowerPoint will be included and there are resources at the end of that as well.
Great, I was gonna ask.
Also, do you mind if I try one quick thing that I normally do after these types of discussions?
Sure.
It can be exasperating for many of us. So I tend to say this, on the count of 3, join me in taking a deep breath, all right? Count of 3, we take a deep breath. 1, 2, 3, breathe in, release. Now, wasn't that relaxing? The answer is yes, but also imagine if you couldn't take that breath. What would the reality be if you could not take that breath? And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Castle. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Part 3 of our Reimagining America series is If You Protest, You May Die. If You Don't Protest, You May Die. A Generation Z Perspective on Political Engagement. This is the last program in our series and it is on Friday at 1 p.m. Please register for it if you haven't already. I will close registration 24 hours before the program begins. Thank you, everyone. Again, thank you, Dr. Hopson, Dr. Castle. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.